Hey everybody, welcome to another GG WoW video. We got our raid DPS tier list coming up here. Worth noting, a lot of stuff to get to. Real quick, this is our Wowhead raid PvE DPS tier list. So if you want to go check it out on Wowhead, we'll have a link in the description where you can go see it there. There it will be updated as well as we learn things and as balance changes come in. Also worth noting, this is a tier list for high-end mythic progression, how much value we think each of these specs will bring to a mythic progression team, which means it's not necessarily designed to directly correlate with the damage meter so much as how much value, like how good it is to have one or multiple of these specs in your raid roster compared to not having them. So in some cases, there will be a little bit of a discrepancy between that and the damage meters, especially when you're looking at like heroic damage meters versus the mythic damage meters, where often there are some specs that look really good, but, you know, it's just pad on the AoE fights, right? Whatever.
I mean, there's also weird stuff where it's like melee versus ranged. Whenever you're generally only running like 5 to 7 slots for melee versus like 7 to 9 slots for ranged. And so obviously ranged are going to more often than not be a little bit just on average favored a little bit higher. There's also some things like if a universal utility button is like ends up being super solid for some specific encounter and you end up stacking them or like it's mandatory for a couple of fights, then obviously that spec is going to be better even if their damage is, let's say, lackluster.
Raid buffs are another huge point of value. There are some classes that don't have those that are in more pain. There are also some classes that have their raid buff, right? But a good healer or a good tank has that same effect, right? And therefore you're not bringing that first copy as the DPS, right? This tier list, we're trying to take that into account, but it does mean that if we're wrong about which tanks and healers are good, then that might change which DPS are good just based on which ones are bringing that buff versus which ones don't have to anymore. Finally, it's worth noting that the raid testing compared to M+ testing has been a lot less thorough. There's been a lot of M+ testing that came after the 40% damage change. There hasn't been a lot of raid testing after that one. So our entire read of raid testing is much more limited for that reason. It's likely that this has a lot more mistakes in it than our M+ tier list. And also it's worth noting that top-end M+ers stream their M+ from beta. Top-end raiders do not stream raid testing and do not talk about raid testing for competitive advantage. So it is a lot harder to kind of get expert opinions for this sort of thing.
I mean, both of us did all of the raid testing and we're in top 100 world guilds, so our read on it is fairly solid, but we just haven't done as much thorough raid testing as some of these maybe race world first guilds. I think generally our read on what's going to be good, though, I think it should be pretty solid. Things will change, likely things will change, and we are going to be updating the Wowhead DPS tier list as well, so if you're watching this 2 weeks from now, you might want to go check and see if there is anything that has changed. There also may be class tuning as well that pushes stuff to be edited.
All right, now there's a lot of classes to get to. They've added another one for us this expansion as well, so we are going to try and head through with some speed. Our first class up in the S tier is Havoc Demon Hunter, which right now is just a tremendous damage dealer. The source of DPS that it's bringing. They got a nerf recently on beta in the final week of beta. It wasn't very much. The spec is still hard chilling, near the top of the damage meters, not to mention the fact that the first one is bringing Chaos Brand, which means that the first Havoc Demon Hunter, going from 0 to 1 Havoc Demon Hunters in your raid is a unbelievable damage increase.
So some of the biggest things too is like, we didn't talk about it, but Vault of the Incarnates just in general has a decent amount of like cleave or like AoE encounters. Havoc Demon Hunter doesn't lose basically any damage to be able to play for some variable forms of like sustained cleave and whatnot. And so they're able to do basically top tier single target damage while also being able to do top tier cleave. If you've played with one of these in M+, you know how stupidly strong they are. On top of that, they require basically no healing. They're one of the most defensive DPS in the game. And I have a suspicion that they are an S tier DPS, even though they're melee right now, which is difficult to do. S tier for melee normally means that they occupy something like 2 slots just for this one spec. Like, I wouldn't be shocked to see multiple copies of Havoc Demon Hunter fairly consistently.
Right. I mean, I think that's the guess we're making here with S, is that like 2 or 3 are more likely than 1 even for this spec. Last time we saw melee doing this well was like what DK in Castle Nathria was kind of up there, and then before that hasn't really been S tier melee in my memory of rating going back to like 7.0. So it is indeed a hard place to be.
I mean, again, they're like 5 to 7 slots. I mean, you need 2 or 3 of them to be classified as like, oh, okay, this is like ridiculously strong.
All right, let's talk about Warlocks next. We have 3 different Warlock specs. One of them is in A tier. That is the Demonology Warlock. The next 2 are in B tier. That is Affliction and Destruction. Now, our tiering of these is a little bit... the 3 specs are tiered a little like Demo and Destro, I'm not actually sure which of these is going to be kind of the go-to on the hard raid fights. So there we could see a flip between the two of those, depending on which ones are actually good on the encounters. Demonology, I think, is going to be the better one, but the way that it has to play, especially with the new Nether Portal thing, means that it's somewhat susceptible to disruption from mechanics and from movement-intensive encounters, whereas Destruction may be able to thrive a little bit better, depending on how the hard fights actually end up working out.
I do think the big thing to note, though, is like for any like stacked cleave or something like that, Demonology is definitely going to start pulling ahead, and then Vault of the Incarnates, again, as I stated earlier, there are a decent amount of fights that just have random mobs that are sitting on top of the boss that you want to cleave down. Or alternatively, you're doing things like Broodkeeper, where you're running around the room and there's ads that you want to cleave down. And that's going to be generally more strong for Demonology than it is for Destruction. Affliction occupies its own niche, though, with the multi-dotting paradigm, right?
Exactly, yeah. Affliction, it's the kind of thing where you maybe are going to play it on a few fights for that reason. Not good for single target, not something that you'll play on a single target encounter, but on something like Broodkeeper Diurna, Primal Council, those might be encounters where you could see Affliction sort of getting a chance to shine. So that is our, I guess, Warlock thoughts.
So additionally, here's kind of the deal with Warlocks just in general. A lot of ranged, as you're going to see, aren't exactly like doing exceptional amounts of damage. They're not like the highest DPS overall. So Warlock, it's easier to fill the 18th, 19th, 20th slot on your raid roster with a second copy of a Warlock specialization, just because of some of the things that they bring defensively. Even if they're not necessarily top tier damage, just a lot of the things that they do is fairly strong. You're never going to hate a second copy of like a Gate or something like that. And so Warlock is normally going to see a decent amount of play, and that's why I do also think it warrants at least having one of the specs in A tier, because you're going to run two copies more often than not, I think.
Yeah, there hasn't been a tier in a while where you haven't played at least two Warlocks, or at least two Warlocks has been fine. And often there's multiple, more than
one is minimum, and that's due likely to Healthstones, Soulstone, Reses.
Honestly, Summon, Ritual of Summoning, TVH. Like, we had that week where we couldn't play with it in Castle Nathri. That was the worst week of my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just weird spec, or weird class.
Up next, we have the Druids. We have placed Balance in A and Feral in B, which is actually higher than Feral normally gets on lists like this. And Feral in general has just been looking good on the damage department in Dragonflight. Balance, on the other hand, I would say it's been sort of a downer patch cycle / beta cycle for them, but they are bringing Innervate, which is extremely valuable for your Discipline Priest if you're playing one, for your Mistweaver Monk potentially, right? That's a huge piece of value there. And they're just such an easy spec to slot into your raid roster. They bring you that Mark of the Wild, but also like just if you need somebody to go do a mechanic and like be far range away from the boss, they can bear form and live out there and do something, over super far away. They have a bunch of niche little pieces of utility. So the A there for Balance, I don't know how you feel about it, obviously as a Balance main. I know you've been doing a little bit of dooming on the spec, but that's why I think it still deserves an A.
I do dooming on the spec, but I actually think it's pretty, I think it's middle of the pack in raid, which means that it's good, right? Middle of the pack, it's kind of similar to the Warlock situation where it's like, oh, okay, so this is like, you have like 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th slot not locked up in your raid roster. You may as well slot in that second Moonkin because, again, you're not getting diminishing returns on really Innervate. Are you really ever upset to have another Stampeding Roar? No. So I think that like multiple copies of the spec, especially whenever you have some of these range, like fights for ranged, you want a decent amount of ranged just fights in general. And so it's like one of those situations where another copy of Moonkin is not too bad. Now, there could be potential for cheese on some fights. Like there's always weird stuff with like Starfall. I saw there was a screenshot of somebody trying to run 4 Moonkins on Broodkeeper, maybe there's something weird with that fight. So Moonkin could potentially be stackable in a weird way, but I don't think there's reason to put it anything above A. I think this is a fair place for it.
Yeah.
So for Feral's big strength is just generally their cleave. Like their Primal Wrath damage is fairly solid. This is probably one of the highest DPS specs in the game on like Primal Council. Unfortunately for Feral, Primal Council is like the third boss of the raid. So not exactly the fight that you necessarily want to be the best in the game on. But there are a lot of like fights where AoE is incredibly strong. And so Feral will be kind of successful on those style encounters. Feral's single target damage seems a little bit middle of the pack is what I will say about the Feral single target damage. But I think that this is definitely better than Feral has been in the past, and it's a situation where you could actually play it pretty considerably on most fights, and you shouldn't be shocked to see them. Again, they're melee though, so they're going to be slightly worse just at an innate level.
All right, up next we have the Shamans. Here we have a little bit of an inversion where we've placed the melee in A and the ranged in B for our Shaman specs. Wind Fury Totem being one of the big reasons that enhancement has been so good since that's been introduced in 9.0. You've seen a lot of enhancement in different places, but also their damage in general has been looking pretty good. They took a 25% nerf about a month ago, but then they got more than half of that damage kind of buffed back in over a series of buffs that came after the fact. So they're still looking very solid on damage, and they add quite a bit of damage to your melee group, depending on which melee specs you're bringing through that Wind Fury Totem. The Wind Rush has taken a little bit of a nerf. It's now substantially worse than Stampeding Roar, but it is still a piece of Shaman utility, although it's if you got the Stampeding Roars, you'd much rather do it that way.
Or do you expect to kind of see like a full melee squad again, like a full 5 stack of melee or full 4 stack of melee revolving around that Wind Fury Totem?
Maybe, yeah. I'm not 100% sure how well the other good specs are using Wind Fury. I know Arms still uses it quite well, but Arms is something, spoiler alert, that we're not tiering especially high. So I think that it's more going to be a case of like the Wind Fury is adding, maybe 2% or 3% damage to your melee group, 4%, something like that, which it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it does change the enhancement from doing good damage, doing great damage, and we think brings it into A.
Yeah. It also is like their raid buff, more or less, if you look at it that way. I think that one big thing, too, with enhancement, great single target damage, really good funnel. So that's a situation where enhancement's going to excel. For Ellie, Jack of all trades, master of none. Basically, I think it's above average at everything from what I've seen, at least in... So initially, in raid testing, it kind of sucked, and then it got a couple of buffs. And so then it became a situation where Ellie, it's not the best single target, it's not the best like stacked cleave, it's pretty decent survivability wise. Ultimately, you don't play a bunch of elemental shamans and then they don't have a raid buff. And so it's difficult to justify bringing in Ellie Shaman, even like the first copy of an Ellie Shaman over some of these other ranged DPS, because if they're doing similar damage, they don't necessarily have the utility to really back up doing just okay damage, right? At least from a raid perspective. And so that's always going to be to the detriment of Ellie. Now, I think their damage is going to be fine. And so like if you're looking to play it, you're not going to have too many issues. And that's one of the big reasons that we like put it in B is like, it's not bad. It's like, and it's not even niche. It's like actually pretty well rounded. It just doesn't excel at either utility or like damage.
Yeah, it's a spec that's easy to imagine the Elemental Shaman being quite a good member of your raid team, but it's also easy to imagine maybe half the guilds in the top 100 not playing an Elemental Shaman at all, right? Because they aren't bringing any raid buff. They're just there for their damage, right? And for being a solid role player. But in that spot, maybe you just lob them for somebody that is actually bringing something, or for, again, that second copy of a Moonkin, second copy of a Warlock, which maybe has a better fight or two for it somewhere in there.
Yeah, just specifically, B is like good specs that will be in many, if not all, top performing raid compositions. We expect to see these to be slightly behind in either damage or utility when compared to the A tier specs, but to still be frequent choices, which I think that fits Ellie well. Is it bad? No. Do you expect to see it be mandatory or even preferred on every single fight? Also, no.
All right, up next we have the Rogues. We are placing Assassination in A, and we are placing Outlaw and Subtlety in B. Although subtlety in B, maybe even that could be the low end of B as well, where it's tough to be sure, because I do think that Assassination is likely to be the primary rogue spec especially for the single target focused encounters. It's a spec that deals quite a bit of single target damage, and it has a lot of execute damage as well through the Zoldyck training node on its tree. That is a lot of execute damage for the spec. Assassination is also one of those melee specs where when you have to leave the boss for a while, you're not losing as much damage as a lot of other specs when your uptime is interrupted.
Yeah.
It's a spec where you're still kind of vibing as long as it's not during your coolies. So that is a nice upside compared to a lot of other melee specs compared to Outlaw and Subtlety in particular. Outlaw, on the other hand, if you're cleaving, if you're doing sustained 4-target cleave for the whole fight, that might be the kind of case where Outlaw instead pokes in for those fights. Okay,
so I mean, looking at Havoc, Demon Hunter, and S tier, whenever we were talking about that initially, we said that Havoc is like really, really good at both single target and AoE, and that they don't lose very much. Assassination, while they are a single target specialist, doesn't do a lot of great AoE focused damage, and so some of the more important counters, considering the penultimate boss is like an AoE fight, that may be a situation where it's difficult to put Assassination any higher than A. Now, I think that there are some fights that you're going to likely see Assassination like top the damage meter, and to the point where you may even see 2 Assassination rogues in on some fights, but just because of how good they can potentially be with their single target damage. But again, and this is crazy to see melee being stacked in like increments of like 2 or 3. but it just doesn't fit every single fight in the way it would need to be placed anything higher than A. Now, are you upset to be playing Rogue because you're able to swap to Outlaw if you're looking for more AoE? No, you're not upset. You just need to be able to play multiple specializations, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. And you need to go find yourself a nice axe or fist weapon or something to toss in your main hand. Now, it is worth noting that Rogue does have Atrophic Poison, which is a raid buff that has been added in Dragonflight. So the first copy of a Rogue is going to be ubiquitous among top-end raid teams for the value of that Atrophic Poison. But yeah, swapping between your specs does seem pretty good. I would expect maybe not to see much Subtlety Rogue at all, though, from people that are swapping between the specs. I think Sub-Rogues will perform fine when played in Mythic gameplay, but I'm not sure it'll ever actually be better than both Outlaw and Assassination on any given fight. I think often you'll instead see the swapping between Outlaw and Assassination. Subtlety, its AoE is not bad, but it's not better than Outlaws, and it has to choose between doing priority damage and doing AoE damage in any given moment. Its priority damage is good if it is choosing the prio side of things, but it's not anywhere near as good as it was before that 8.1 nerf that just dunked it back down to earth after Zool and Uldir.
Maybe there's a weird situation that would be better on Outlaw if there's like an AoE spot where it's lining up really good with subs cooldowns and you need like burst damage. And you're like,
yeah,
maybe.
It is also a spec that's a little bit more vulnerable to disruption as well than Assassination. Unlike Assassination having a fairly long cooldown, Subtlety has cooldowns fairly frequently, and if it has to do a mechanic during, it is tremendous pain.
They just cloak that. They just cloak that. Bro.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Rogue. Part of the reason that Rogue is so nice as well, it does have a great immunity, short cooldown, talented to cheat death, talented to feint, and feint upgrade as well. So
good spec, really good class.
It is a spec that shouldn't die very much, but yeah, that's our explanation behind our tiering of that.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable.
All right, next class we're going to talk about is Mage. Now, we've placed all 3 Mage specs into the B tier.
Okay.
But it is a situation where we're not sure here. If I had to guess, I'd say it's probably end up being a Mage spec that pulls ahead on most fights. I kind of think it... I don't know.
It seems like it's Arcane. So
the thing is, okay. You go ahead and do your bit about Arcane.
So Arcane is actually fairly strong with like their burst cooldown window, and which is like normally fairly solid for raid because you have things that are so scripted, and so Arcane's not going to lose as much from like super scripted cooldowns. In addition to that, it seems like their single target damage just by itself is like really good. Now, is it going to be good enough to see Mage stacked in multiples? I'm not so sure if it will, but as it currently stands, it doesn't seem like Arcane is really that bad. Now, Fire and Frost definitely have some major weaknesses, but Arcane also has some major weaknesses with like their movement and stuff like that. Yeah,
Arcane, if you're on an encounter where there is frequent, unpredictable movement, that's a spec that's going to lose a lot more than Frost and a lot more than Fire, especially if it's during the execute phase of a fight. But the Fire damage numbers does look to be quite a bit lower than the Arcane number, so I don't know. The thing is, both Frost and Fire bring unique defensive value that Arcane doesn't have, right? You've got Cold Snap on Frost. You've got Cauterize on Fire that represent extra value. And again, Fire with Searing Touch on an encounter means that they are going to be losing less of their damage to mechanics, especially in that vital execute part of a fight, than Arcane or Frost. So that's a thing that Fire has going for it. Frost has going for it is good AoE and good prio damage while it's doing the AoE. It is a sustained DPS class rather than a burst DPS class, which is usually a downside. But on some fights, it's not bad. And in some fights, it can even be a nice upside or a nice way to compensate for the other classes in your raid that are all the bursty classes.
I think that if I had to like order these, it's like Arcane seems like it's the maybe even top of B. It's definitely like a good specialization. Frost is somewhere in the middle, and then Fire is like, you could have honestly put this in C and probably been able to justify this. We ended up putting it in the generous bottom of B.
All I'll say is the last few tiers where people have said Fire was unplayable, it has been used on the world first kill of the last boss. So, underestimate Fire Mage to your downfall. It's a spec that the benefits of, Searing Touch, Cauterize ends up meaning that I think it still has a chance there. Although the damage numbers are looking kind of sus. I'll give you that.
You're being generous, but I think that we'll I think we can just like leave it there. I think that the justification is fair.
I will say I think we had a very similar discussion in Castle Nathria, and it ended up being the Mage spec there, I think.
All right, well, I think it's one of those situations that like if we end up seeing that it's like really underperforming, we can come back and just change it later.
Yeah, check the Wowhead post, see if we've moved these mages, because I do think there's a good chance that we will see these 3 Mage specs, one move to A and one move to C.
I could actually see that. I could see that happening. Yeah.
All right, next class to discuss here is the Shadow Priest, the only DPS spec of the Priest. We're putting that in B as well. Damage is actually quite good on the Shadow Priest. You are bringing power infusion as well.
Yeah.
And unlike Shadowland Shadow Priest, Dragonflight Shadow Priest brings the Twins Legendary basically for free. All of them will have that on their class talent tree. And so they'll be able to power infuse not just themselves, but somebody else as well. And that represents quite a bit of extra damage. The playstyle is one that I've heard a lot of grumbling about from Shadow Priest, but playstyle aside, the damage numbers do appear to be there. And I think that this will be a class that honestly, it maybe has some of the higher risk of our B tier specs of actually being something that should be potentially higher.
There's a problem like I don't think you can realistically play multiple Shadow Priests on most, if not many, fights. I do think that Shadow is like not particularly bad, and I do think the way that they are defensive in raid specifically is pretty solid. So a lot of their raid defensiveness comes from the ability to have like intense amounts of self-healing, which, I mean, you're not getting one-shot Hunter to 0 by some gimmicky mechanic in raid like you are in M+. And so Shadow is actually one of the more defensive specs. Now, for some fights, it actually could even potentially be like top DPS, like Primal Council. But in addition to that, some fights, it's like fairly average. And it's like it's difficult to stack multiple Shadow Priests.
Yeah, again, the power infusion side of thing, multiple power infusions could be compelling for fights where you need it for burst windows. On the other hand, there is diminishing returns, right? The second and third and fourth power infusions are going to find less good targets than the first one.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got it in B here. We'll see how that ends up turning out. Next class is Evoker, where we are placing their DPS class or their DPS spec Devastation, also in the B tier.
Dude, Devastation Evoker has some really good fights designed for them, right?
Yeah, I mean, this spec does pretty well when it gets to have... It's usually when you're talking about not pure single target encounters, right? Because pure single targets, they can feel a little bit anemic on, but Vault of the Incarnates does have quite a lot of fights, as you mentioned earlier, that have either some or many adds involved. It remains to be seen if the add damage is an important part of killing those bosses or not, though. And Razageth as well. Razageth has intermissions with adds, at least in the Dungeon Journal, although we don't know yet exactly how important damage will be there and how the single target will work in the other phases and how Mythic looks at all on that fight.
But from testing, Senarth looked like a great fight for Devastation Evokers, like how they do AoE. Primal Council also looked great for them, and then Broodkeeper also looked fairly solid with the way that they deal AoE damage.
Yeah, then there are some fights like Dathia Ascended where there's some promising bits, like, hey, there's a bunch of ads stacked up on these platforms. Great to go over there, send a Flame Breath, send a Essence Burst into them, or turn Surge, whatever the 2 Empower spells are, into those things. But on the other hand, the 25-yard range of this class is quite painful on that encounter in particular. You have to play very close to melee range, and it can be a challenge.
Some people will look at this and be like, oh yeah, a Devastation Evoker is like really bad because of the range. I cannot think of a fight that we saw during raid testing that was like, okay, this is unplayable for Devastation. Yeah,
it's honestly the only one where I even heard the Devastation Evoker in my raid complaining was Dathia Ascended.
Could it have happened in the future? Yes. Could it even happen on Razageth? Absolutely.
Razageth as well. We have no idea. Yeah, the Razageth could totally be like that.
Now, all of the bosses that we had for raid testing, none of them are like, okay, you can't play an Evoker because of the range on this fight.
Yeah, indeed. The range thing ended up being much more of a concern for the healers, although the healer range is longer than the DPS range. Still, I would say it's much more likely to be the problem for Preservation than for Devastation. Anyways, up next we have the Hunter. Hunter is, we've placed Beast Mastery in B.
Okay.
And then the other specs, we have very bad news. We are placing Marksmanship in D and Survival in C.
Okay.
Now,
a very generous C.
Yeah, and potentially a generous D as well. This is a class that is struggling both in raid and in M+. In M+, it's struggling on defenses. In raids, it's also struggling on defenses against rot damage. This is a class that tends to require the most healing of any DPS class, right? If you look at, you can go look in logs, you can go to the damage taken tab, you can change it to EHRPS, effective healing required per second.
Yeah.
And you will see the hunters generally near the top of that list. There have been fights where last year where hunters have been above tanks in this metric, Blood Death Knights to be fair, but still it is a tough place to be as a class, and it's a class that has lost Marksman's Advantage, which was an extremely powerful conduit defensively, and it hasn't gained very much in the class and spec trees to compensate for that, whereas several of the other classes on our list have.
Yeah.
So the danger of falling over to passive damage is real. Add on to that the fact that Marksmanship is doing negative damage. Marksmanship is healing the boss, not itself.
Yeah, okay, so I guess I'll talk about the upside of Beast Mastery a little bit, since you gave a scathing review of Hunter here.
I would say if you're a Hunter and you're sad right now, instead think of my monologue there as calling for Hunter buffs.
That spec needs a buff. Both the specs in, that spec in C and that spec in D needs a buff currently. So the deal with BM is its damage actually looks okay, not like absolute tip top tier, but it looks pretty solid. The downside with their damage is like there's basically no burst damage. If you look at their damage on a like a sim graph, it's basically a flat line, which is not great, but overall, I think that Beast Mastery's damage is fairly solid. Now, what they do bring is like they have a pretty unique advantage of being highly mobile, which on some of the mechanically intensive fights, or there are actually a decent amount of fights that have high movement, and I actually think that they may be able to be the spec that carries the Trident on Broodkeeper as well to be able to open up those eggs. I think that Beast Mastery Hunter would be like great for a job like that.
Yeah, Beast Mastery, the mobility is a unique advantage of them. It means as well that even though their damage profile is sustained rather than bursty, they are unlikely to ever actually be disrupted from their damage. They should be able to continue full uptime of their damage just the whole way through. So yeah, absolutely. I think the Hunter spec that we will see, it's just a question of if the Hunter class is one that the top guilds even gear.
It's one of those situations that if you start looking for a spec to drop when you're looking at like raid bosses, the Beast Mastery Hunter is normally going to be very high on that list because they don't have like cooldowns assigned for specific points of the fight that matter.
All right, up next we have the Windwalker Monk. We're also placing this one in that B tier, which is it's interesting because throughout beta, this looked really good on some boss fights, and there are several boss fights where I think this will be a really strong pick. Any of the cleave-oriented encounters, I think Windwalker is looking really good for, but the spec single target is somewhat worrying to me, and there are a lot of melee classes that we've already placed in the S and A tiers, which means the melee spots on those encounters might be limited. So I'm a little bit worried about it for potentially Razageth and for those harder fights being like we saw in Sanctum of Domination, right? You'd play Windwalker, it was pretty good on a lot of the fights, gets dropped for Sylvanas, right? And that ends up being something that I'm a little bit worried about that pattern repeating itself here.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment of where Windwalker Monk currently lands. I mean, it could also be one of the situations where if Razageth is like really AoE focused or like burst AoE focused specifically, Windwalker Monk could absolutely be like tip top damage. And then obviously we know that the final two bosses of any raid encounter are normally the most two important fights to be like ranking a spec around. Windwalker is pretty good on Broodkeeper, all things considered, because of how the ads work on Broodkeeper. And so I do think it could be good on that. In addition to that, it brings Mystic Touch. It could be the carrier of Mystic Touch. It really just kind of, at least in my opinion, depends on where Mistweaver stands for a lot of these like top end guilds, like where they want to be getting their Mystic Touch from. I could see you running a Windwalker in every single composition fairly regularly though.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Mystic Touch, if a guild chooses to always have a Windwalker for their Mystic Touch, I think that is a absolutely reasonable decision that we may see some make. And then we might see some guilds instead choose to always bring the Mistweaver, and therefore their Windwalker could be flexing to other stuff or benched on some encounters. I mean,
the last time we saw Brewmaster Monk not absolutely tip top tier, we did see the Windwalker be the spec that was predominantly in its place.
It's worth noting that I'm not confident that Brewmaster won't even... Brewmaster could also be your Mystic Touch carrier, even though when we get to if you watch our tank tier list, we'll talk more about that, though, of course.
Dude, we're going to say all these things about Brewmaster Monk, and then Mirrors is going to show up on a Brewmaster Monk day one again, like he did in Nathria, and everybody's like, what?
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about DPS Death Knights. Now, we've placed both DPS Death Knight specs in B as well, although I initially wanted a little bit lower for Frost. Yeah, you pulled me up to be on Frost.
I lobbied super hard for Frost to be higher. I actually think that Frost is some of the highest 2 to 4 target damage in the game right now, and so there are a lot of AoE fights that I think that Frost is going to really excel on. Their Breath of Sindragosa build, specifically in Raid, does a lot of damage, and then like they have things like Chill Streak and whatnot, and then I think it's Cold Heart is the other name of the ability with the Chains of Ice damage thing.
Yeah, that's Cold Heart.
Yeah. Their 2 target damage is incredibly powerful. Now, the downside is that they don't have any raid buffs. And so it's really, really difficult to bring them in a lot of situations. They do have a numbing poison alike akin effect, but it's worse than numbing poison for some reason.
Yeah, that one's a pretty fake buff to have on a class. The other problem with DPS Death Knights is that both of them are cooldown oriented and both of them are pretty weak at single target, which is a worrying place for a class to be. Unholy has some benefits. Unholy, burst damage is very good. The execute damage, like if you're lusting to execute on Razageth and Razageth goes from like 35 to 0 in the most important part of the fight, maybe that's a place where Unholy actually overperforms, but I'm still a little sus about both of these specs being something that top guilds put gear on and bring to the fights, especially given how good other melee specs are looking near the top of our list.
Abel Limb and Grippy Hands didn't look very mandatory on many encounters though, right?
Yeah, death grips in general, there are some fights where they are very good, but I'm not sure there are any of those in here. I mean, there are ad fights. There's Death the Ascended, there's Broodkeeper Diurna, where picking up ads and stuff could be good, and gripping in ads. There's like a spawn of mages on Broodkeeper that I could see having grips for being nice, but I don't think that it necessarily ascends to the level of like Soul Render Dormazane, right, where having death grips was hugely valuable on that encounter.
Or Anduin, even where you needed like almost two DKs minimum. Where I mean, we sniffed that out immediately. Where you're just like, okay, you definitely want to be playing multiple Death Knights on Anduin, so this is like a thing.
Yeah, I don't see anything getting close to that level. Yeah. Although, again, don't know what Razageth looks like. We do know that there are intermissions with ads. Maybe gripping them all together quickly will be a thing of value. DPS DKs can get Abomination Limb. They can't get Gorfine's Grasp, is my... Yeah,
that is true. I think that overall, though, like, so you said that their single target is not exactly great, but their cleave is very, like, normally pretty good. Again, most of the fights have cleave. You're not upset to, like, it's kind of okay. A lot of the time you see a decent amount of raid fights and they don't have just like ads spawning all the time or just like cleave readily available. But a lot of the Vault of Incarnates counters do have ads of some kind. The only patchwork fight is Taros.
Yeah, that being said, important damage is often to the single target, and there are a lot of fights as well where you need to cover a lot of ground. If you need to get from point A to point B, Death Knight is not the class you want to be on to be undertaking that adventure. Although there are a few knockbacks against which Death's advanced knockback immune is pretty nice. So
fair enough.
A little bit upside there. The mobility mostly though a huge downside for the class.
Okay.
All right. Up next, let's see. We've done Shaman, we've done Warlock. So up next we have Paladin, Retribution Paladin, which we are tiering in C. Off of, the cleave, not bad. Single target not looking especially fantastic for the rep pallies either, though, right?
So you may look at this and you're like, oh, okay. Well, they actually rank this in A tier for their M+ tier list. They talked about how good it is on AoE. Now, whenever you're looking at this for raid in particular, their single target damage is really bad with the raid build that they're running. And then like a lot of the reasons that they were good in M+ is because they're able to press Consecration and do a lot of damage just with that Consecration kind of build. For raid, their single target damage is just so bad in particular, and they're not able to really leverage that AoE in a meaningful way. You talked about how DKs were going to be struggling if it was going to come down to their single target damage. Rep Pally is just that, except it's even more expanded to the point where they're a lot worse on single target than even the Death Knights, to the point where it's like, oh, okay, this is a spec that is going to struggle in raid.
Now, Rep Pally does have a lot of valuable utility that having effects like Bop and Lay on Hands and stuff can be really nice, especially in the hands of a master Rep Pally. Could be something that is nice about it. But again, in a world where there are a lot of melee specs that look really, really good, it becomes increasingly hard to invest in a spec like Rep Paladin for a top rating team. All right. Our final class to take a look at is Warrior. Now, we've tiered both Warriors in C. It's pretty ambitious, I would say, to put both Warrior specs down here into the C tier, because DPS Warrior is one of the more common things, because they've got Rally, they've got Battle Shout. That being said, Prot Warrior is looking quite good. Prot Warrior as your source of Battle Shout, I think, is going to be a pretty common way to get that, which means you maybe don't need it from your DPS Warriors. So your DPS Warriors are potentially instead just bringing the second and the third Rallying Cry, which is good, but it's no longer insane. These two specs do have slightly different problems with them. For arms, it's a case of either I'm building for single target or I'm building for AoE, and on these encounters that have some of both, I'm not looking all that hot. I very much need to be in a group with a enhancement shaman to be doing good damage as well off of the Wind Fury totem. So if we cut that, then we got to cut me too. Fury, on the other hand, can actually swap between single target and AoE on fights that have both, but the overall damage there is what I'm worried about for that class, or for that spec.
Dude, whenever you're going through raid testing and you're just like, somebody's like, oh, okay, scroll down to the bottom of the meter and see how much damage the healer's doing, and it's just like, oh, okay, now I found the warriors. What were they doing down there with the healers?
Yeah, that has been the common experience here as well, which means that it's the kind of thing where, like, a little tuning buff to these classes, and all of a sudden we're in a different world here as well. But yeah, that's the reason that we have them down in C. Interested to see how it ends up shaking up for them. But there it is. There's all the DPS specs. We've gotten through these in pretty quick pace. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Everybody that's been watching it, let us know in the comments which spec you think we are most horribly wrong about, or time-honored tradition, come back here in a few months' time and say, just how silly we were about whichever one of these is the most wrong, and how everybody knew that it was not going to look like this.
We're going to be updating the tier list, though. So
yep, the Wowhead article will be updated, but this is our initial guesses. We'll actually, I may come back as well, maybe either together or separately, make a video just talking about the biggest mistakes that we had in this list too. So it should be something that we can kind of track and see what went wrong. It is worth noting as well, balance changes are potentially going to come and interfere with this as well. So not something to be taken too seriously. Not something, if you're deciding your own main character, you should be doing it based off of your own testing and stuff. If you're looking at that rather than off of our testing here, it's just, it's a tier list. It's supposed to be entertaining, informational, not something that you gotta take as gospel. So
all right.
Anyways, those disclaimers aside, that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching.